My name is Rami, Essaid, co-founder and CEO of Distill Networks. We're a web application security company, and today I'm here to talk about just the evolution of web security, how it's been changing the past couple of years, some of the trends, and in web applications that's driving, and web infrastructure that's driving the need to change how you view security in general. So we'll talk about, some of the trends in apps, in infrastructure, and the impact that it's had on IT security teams. Before I get started, how many of you guys here care about security? I mean, you're here talking about security, but that's not the really core focus of the conference. Are you guys developers, infrastructure, DevOps? What's the mix? I'm seeing some heads nod on DevOps. What's the mix? Mostly DevOps? Your performance, okay. Performance cares about security. I like it. Developer, infrastructure? Okay, all right. One of the reason I ask is one of the trends that's happening is we're seeing a lot more of the security focus move away from you as a developer towards the DevOps and the infrastructure team. In the past, it used to be, you set up a firewall. That was your security posture, right? And then we started talking about application security. So you needed to have a web application firewall, or a lot of the load balancers started incorporating security features. And what we're seeing now is even more of what was traditionally in the realm of developers is shifting towards more security-focused people. Things like, for example, APIs that are fully managed by developers. Even the API gateways, we're starting to see some workings of DevOps coming in and taking control of that. But that trend, I think, is going to continue to go that way. Unfortunately, you're here as a developer, but not many developers have a security-focused mindset. And so you really need, and you can't drive security, I think, with policy. So there's going to be a lot more of things that fall into the realm of the CIO, the CISO, and his team to be able to control that. And that's going to go to mobile, I think. That's going to go to the Internet of Things, and so on. And I mentioned APIs as one point. If we think about APIs in general, we're more reliant on them than ever, right? The websites used to be fully encompassed as an app. Now websites are a shell of an app that load everything from internal APIs. Sometimes those internal APIs are the same APIs you use to load data in your mobile app. They're connecting you with other partners. We have more of a reliance on web services than ever. And unfortunately, we haven't seen people protect those APIs as well as they've protected their web app. Web application firewalls can script and protect your application, but then the APIs are usually left standing there and on their own and really susceptible to hackers and to vulnerabilities. My favorite example is somebody reverse engineering the Tinder API earlier this year. Did you guys hear about that one? See, a guy got bored. Just not out of malice, really, just because he could, reverse engineered the Tinder API and started interconnecting guys with each other. So you were chatting and you're like, hey, what are you wearing? And somebody responds back, it's like, I'm wearing a t-shirt and jean shorts, what are you wearing? And it's two guys, really funny chat messages, but it was a huge black eye for Tinder. But they didn't secure their APIs. Right? When you think about mobile APIs, Snapchat, every single breach of data that they've had was literally just somebody reverse engineering their APIs because they weren't secured. So that's one of the key trends. As we get more and more reliant on moving all of our data pushes to APIs, I think it's important to think about from a development standpoint what you can do to secure those APIs, but also from a DevOps and infrastructure standpoint, how do you get involved in controlling the management gateway? API gateway, because that's not usually your domain, but that's something that you can probably jump into and help better secure. And it's not just that we're getting more complex with APIs. Those APIs are also driving a lot more interconnectivity with third parties, with a lot of extra services, and we're relying more and more on plugins, third-party tools, et cetera, on the main apps that we use day in and day out. What that means is really every day is a 0 day. Right? There's so many vulnerabilities coming in and day out from third-party apps that leave you vulnerable because they're integrated into your web app or into your own application. So making sure that you stay on top of the entire stack of what you're using, both from open source tools and plugins, repositories, gems, any of those things, and constantly keeping an eye out for new vulnerabilities. It's more important than ever to stay on top of that. I think, I don't even know what number patch we're at on WordPress, right? There seems to be a WordPress vulnerability that comes out every other day, right? But they're not innocuous, right? With every single WordPress vulnerability, half of them could give me access to your root server. I quite literally can get root access to the server by with a lot of the vulnerabilities that come in from WordPress, but we've seen that with a lot of things that you're plugging into. Your SSH, if you're using OpenSSH, that was vulnerable last year. Bash, Poodle, all those things are coming in and day out. So keeping on top of patches is really important. You need to run your own vulnerability scans, but also make sure that you're not in a race condition, I think, with the bad guys. So don't try to prevent unauthorized vulnerability scans. Make sure that you're keeping an eye out for that. What we've noticed we did a study, it takes most organizations 7 to 10 days to respond to a 0 day. But after an hour to 3 hours of every 0 day being announced, there is a spike in vulnerability scans and people looking to see who's vulnerable and who's not. So the bad guys react as soon as the 0 day is announced. And every mom and pop hacker, every kid in a basement is going to look at your website and see if you're vulnerable to the latest thing. But it's going to take you as an organization more than a couple of hours to patch and get over that. So there's this window where you're in kind of a race condition to who's going to win, the kid in the basement that just found out that this new vulnerability exists, or the slow IT team that's going to take a couple of days to patch it. Actually, I'm going to take a quick pause. Any questions so far? Anything coming up? All right. We talked about the constant reliance on a lot of different tools, the increase of complexity in your stack, but the infrastructure itself is getting more and more complex. And we're seeing a lot of companies now, more than ever, distributed geographically. People realize that they need multiple data centers, they need DR, and now people are moving towards a hybrid approach, going from cloud to dedicated hosting to some in on-prem devices, and the complexity in which you're integrating these hybrid data centers, hybrid infrastructure models. It's leaving a lot of organizations with a very mixed security posture. You buy a on-premise device that works great for data centers, but they don't have a cloud appliance, right? So then you have to go get a different vendor for your cloud appliance, and those two things don't end up talking. Whatever you have, this hybrid model, it's important to think about your entire stack and how much of that stack is virtualized, how much of the stuff that you currently are doing as physical devices will move over to the cloud, and how will they work together. Most devices, most companies that we see, when they have multiple data centers deployed, those data centers don't talk in any way. The firewalls don't have, barely have the same rule sets, but they don't have any knowledge of each other's access patterns. The WAFs definitely don't know when they've blocked certain IPs, and especially in a DR situation, they do a hot rollover, but they don't actually transfer over the access control list. Make sure that your data centers, your infrastructure stays in sync. Otherwise, it really defeats the whole purpose of a lot of the security that you're doing right now. And we're pushing a lot more data out to the cloud as well, more than ever. We're not just relying on the cloud for infrastructure and compute, but we're also relying on third-party services to store data, to compute data for us, to analyze data. And what that ends up meaning is a proliferation of attack vectors for people to get access to your data. I wouldn't say the first bullet is true. You don't avoid storing data in the cloud, but what's important is making sure that all your data is secure, that whatever you have out there in the cloud falls within policy. What's really interesting is if you just search Git repositories, you'd be surprised about how many API keys you find embedded in code, right? How many usernames and passwords are sitting there in code in Git. I know several major companies that run their own crawlers across Git looking for their own API keys, and then they go back and tell their users, hey, this is terrible, what are you doing? You're putting your private username and password in Git. It's gotten that bad where companies have to try to correct bad code or bad security policies. So when you put data out there in the cloud, make sure that it's secure. Make sure that it's not that it's encrypted if need be. That it's behind a strong password, and also make sure that whoever you're using as a vendor, that their application is secure. You'd be surprised about how much data you can get from an insecure application. It's the gateway to your database. And for example, AT&T, somebody was able to figure out their application, write a quick bot, and literally probe every single record in their entire database and get every phone number, address, and date of birth, and name and I think even social of their user base, right? Because their web app was not secure. It provided back too much information. The IRS this past year, the data breach that happened wasn't a data breach. It was a web app. It was an insecure web app that allowed people to probe it and get back information. So don't just make sure that whatever data store you use is safe, but make sure that if you have a way to interact with their web application, that their web application is secure as well. Run vulnerability scanners across your vendors, right? Make sure that the vendors that you're using are locking their stuff down. And we're seeing right now an influx of online fraud, right? Breaches are, when we're talking about, make sure that the credentials and data are secure, breaches are the #1 thing that hackers are continuing to go after right now. We've seen this for the past 2 years where they're just accumulating a wealth of usernames, passwords, credit card informations, et cetera. It's no longer about logging, a keylogger or spyware. It really is about harvesting credentials and looking at and gathering data. That's what malware has been doing the past couple of years. That's what the hackers have been doing with breaches. They've been accumulating a wealth of information. There's one Russian group that has over 1 billion usernames and passwords. In any black market username and password list, you're actually going to find about a 1% to 3% overlap on any consumer-facing login, right? So if you want to try, to break into eBay, you can go buy a list for $50 on the black market that's 10,000 usernames and passwords. Guaranteed, you'll find about a 1% overlap with what you buy. It's a huge problem across the industry, and we're just now starting to see the tip of the iceberg. So don't just think about secure policy, secure passwords for yourself, but look for where your passwords have gotten out. Look, there are services out there that compare your email addresses, for example, as an organization, to anything that might have been breached out there. So if somebody used, for example, their company email address to sign up for a third-party service that, just some random marketing thing, and that marketing thing got breached, maybe they use the same password that they use to log into, your cloud accounts. Maybe it's the same password that they use to access the network. Make sure that those things aren't out there floating in the web. Scrub pastebin on a regular basis if you have the opportunity. Look for your domains in a lot of the places that hackers go and post these lists, because we're just seeing the very beginnings of the ramifications of all this data that exists out there in the web, and people honestly don't change passwords enough. Up until 5 years ago, I used the same password for every single website I logged into, and I knew better. But it's now getting to be a scarier and scarier place, and put in strong password policies, obviously, to kind of continue to refresh the passwords internally. And again, going back to the vendors, make sure that you have any vendor that you work with, that you don't let stale passwords exist there or in tools that you plug into. This one's really interesting from a web perspective. 9% of Americans now, after Snowden, are anonymizing their IP. That's not including people that are trying to avoid, do not track, ads or cookies or things like that, using something like Ghostery or ad blocker or anything else. That's a different large pool of users. But 9% of people are no longer allowing you to really know what their true IP is. And that's growing internationally. That's growing right now year over year. And what that means is a lot of the traditional security that where your access control lists are based on IPs, they're really useless. The guys that want to do something malicious across your infrastructure are not going to just sit there and come from the same IP. If you think that IP blocking is a strong part of your security posture, then you're really fooling yourself in terms of what you're really going to be able to accomplish. Even IP reputation databases are murky at best, and what the next slide will actually talk about kind of the gray area. But there's now this new wave of relying on fingerprints, relying on next generation ways to track and identify individuals regardless of what IP they come from. And that's I think a key part of what you should think about from your fraud strategy and from your security posture. It actually also goes as far as having implications across your analytics as well. More and more people are breaking analytics by using Ghostery, by using ad blocker, and analytics that are IP-based are also kind of falling behind. So the more you can start thinking about fingerprints and the next generation of ways of tracking users, the better you're gonna be. And I was talking earlier about IP lists kind of being murky at best. It's no longer black and white. Nothing is really black and white on when you consider an access control list, or when you consider fraud, or when you consider most hacking attempts. A lot of people, the malicious actors, the hackers, are coming in either from NATs or from Tor. They're coming in from locations that you're not going to be able to just simply block an IP. The fraud's happening from distributed networks, and it's getting harder and harder to pinpoint the individuals behind the fraud. And so your narrow funnel of what you see is not enough to actually make a decision anymore. you're seeing individual data points across, users or across IPs, and it's not enough to differentiate between black and white, to take that gray and make a binary decision about a transaction or a user or an interaction. And so it's more important than ever to start leveraging ways to interconnect with other services. There's fraud services that allow you to share information and get information back from the network. There's a lot of new network tools that do the same, that aggregate your SIM data to with what they see from others, so that you can have that network intelligence, that community effect across a number of different devices. And that's, I think, a really important piece of what you need to do moving forward to be able to prevent, or to be able to differentiate between, to take that gray transaction and be able to make a binary decision on what you should do, whether you should allow that transaction through or not, or you should allow that user access or not. Another interesting trend that's happening is across web browsers, and how much more complex every single web browser has gotten. You look back at what web pages looked like in 1999, really simple. Now, as web pages have gotten more complex, as apps have gotten more complex, the browsers have gotten more complex, and those browsers are filled with ways to be able to plug into them and interact with them, which makes the bad guy gives the bad guy a whole new war chest of tools to be able to hijack browsers, to be able to craft more sophisticated malware than ever, and to be able to create more advanced bots than ever. What we've seen in the past couple of years is a proliferation of advanced bots that are actually embedded in browsers. This is just one example of what's happened now with the advancement of browsers, that bots and malware are being leveraged from within browsers themselves, instead of just malware on a machine, to do the man-in-the-middle attacks, to be able to hijack sessions. And while we keep trying to come up with standards to be able to prevent that, the complexities of browsers are being exploited every day. So there's not really the takeaway is that it's getting harder to track the malware, that it's getting harder to track bots, but there's not really as much that you can do other than getting really good purpose-built solutions for those problems if you have them. And we're seeing the same thing happen, and so a traditional WAF is not going to be able to detect a bot or and so on. The same thing's happening actually across mobile. This is kind of the heyday. There's now more mobile users, more mobile devices than there are desktop browsers, right? So the world of mobile is exploding, and it's growing at a much faster rate, and it's an untapped army. It's an untapped army of botnets. It's people are now doing more and more on their mobile devices that are transactions are sensitive, and what it's leading to is more and more hackers realizing that this is just a wide open field. So whereas in 2012 and 2013 it was less than 1% of bad traffic, malicious traffic that we saw across the web coming from mobile. Last year, we saw up to 5% of malicious traffic coming from rooted Android devices and malware on Android, and that's just growing by almost an order of magnitude year over year. So when it comes to your application, don't assume that or your website, your web infrastructure, don't assume that mobile is safe. Don't assume that mobile traffic is innocuous anymore. But what it also comes down to, your mobile app. You make sure that your sandbox, that you're writing secure code, especially on Android, but even in iOS, you have to take into account the considerations that people are going to jailbreak their device and do something stupid and install a piece of malware on there that's going to try to get through. So take whatever precautions you can to to not store things on device and continue to keep them behind a firewall. We're seeing, if you look at mobile traffic, the explosion of mobile traffic happened really in Asia and Africa, and those mobile carriers are carrying a lot of malicious traffic. It's definitely exploding. Whereas AT&T, still has maybe 2%, 3% mobile negative malicious traffic. China Telecom, China Mobile, we're well into the double digits. Almost a quarter of their traffic is malicious. And that's kind of the high-level summary of both the trends and the implications across security. My marketing team would be remiss if I didn't introduce Distill as a company and what we do. So with Distill, we concentrate on web application security, but namely identifying the difference between real people and automated computer programs across your web infrastructure. So we block bots. To bring it down in a short. When you think about some of the things that I was talking about, we really took those to heart when we were building Distill, when we were coming up with how to be able to detect bots from the ground up. So instead of IPs, for example, our access control lists are all based on fingerprints. And in fact, our appliances will append a fingerprint to every single request header so you can leverage that fingerprints across your entire application. We aggregate the knowledge across all of our, yeah?
What are you using to actually make those fingerprints? Like, what is the data that you use to decide?
No, we're really transparent. So you asked two different questions. You asked what pieces of data do we use for our fingerprint, and how do we decide if it's a bot or not, right? Those are different for us. The fingerprints, really what we're trying to do is identify a web browser. And so we care about individualizing every single web browser across the web. That's important to us because we want to be able to block, one malicious browser, behind a net of maybe 100 users or 1,000 users.
So your fingerprint is a browser, but not a page.
Right. So the fingerprint itself is based on every single browser. So there's a lot of papers written about this, anything from looking at what plugins are installed, looking at the JavaScript engine, looking at the Flash engine. There's a technique called canvas fingerprinting where you draw a hidden image, and how the browser renders that image gives you about 7 points of entropy around the individuality of that browser. You take all of those points together, aggregate it, and you get enough points to uniquely identify my browser versus your browser, even though we're both running MacBook Pros. That I think is the trend of where every web application security company is going to go. We've seen one make that shift this year, but their fingerprinting is actually a joke, Radware. But I think more and more you're going to see WAFs develop this, and I think anything that's trying to act on layer 7 is going to move towards fingerprinting. The other question you asked is how do we detect a bot, and that's really step 3 and step 4 in this, right? We stopped assuming that whatever people said in their headers is true. So the web was built on a system of trust, right? So you have we've had to bolt on security after the fact. So we first didn't have SSL, and we had to bolt on SSL, and then we had to bolt on DNSSEC because we're just assuming that any information you give us is true until we realize that people take advantage of that. So when you think about a web browser, it sends back a lot of information, one of which is a user agent identifying itself to you, the headers that come through, how it interacts with you. That's one way that bots exist, right? You write a computer program that just spoofs a user agent. So we validate every single header that comes in. If you say that you're IE6, well, IE6 runs four threads. Right? It can download resources 4 at a time. It has a limited JavaScript engine. Its headers are formatted in one way versus, let's say, IE8 that can multi-thread up to 16 different connections, that has a much more sophisticated engine, that has a different backend .NET framework. So we can interrogate those things asynchronously as the traffic is coming through, and be able to make sure you are exactly who you say you are. If you say you're, IE6, then you better be IE6. And so that's one aspect of it. Then there's a lot of people that integrate into browsers, right? Selenium, WebDriver, .NET, Ruby, Water. There's a lot of ways to automate real web browsers, but they usually leave some sort of breadcrumb behind. And in our interrogation, we've been able to find all those technologies that I've named. We can find a breadcrumb and detect that in line. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that are 0-day, right? You can write a custom hook into a web browser that we've maybe never seen before, so we don't know what to look for in that breadcrumb. In that scenario, we've already filtered out a lot of the noise, and what we look for then, we use machine learning to find anomalies in web traffic. Bot interactions tend to be either very, very random or very, very systematic, and they both tend to fall outside of the norm. If you think about any way that you traditionally try to find something malicious, you pour through the logs and you look for anomalies, right? It's been very reactive in security to date. So we took that mindset and said, how do we flip it on its head? What are the things that we would normally look for in the logs? And let's set computers to do this looking. And let's let them predict when something's going to be bad instead of react to when something is bad. And so in real time, we have machine learning models that are constantly pouring through a live stream of your web traffic compared to a snapshot of what it looked like in the past and finding anomalies to that. Then what we do is intercept that traffic based on their assumptions, and we challenge it with a Turing test. So whether it's a CAPTCHA or an email validation or a chat window, and we're coming up with a lot of new Turing tests. These Turing tests, we randomize through them, and that gives us a feedback mechanism back into the machine learning algorithms. Otherwise, it's just behavioral models that are static, and you have to adapt. So if we intercept somebody's connection and we think it's a bot, they pass the CAPTCHA, then shit, we got it wrong. And it goes back and adjusts its algorithms accordingly. But if they don't pass it, then it reasserts its algorithms. And so the system continues to self-learn in that way. It's less reactive than just sitting there and pouring through logs, and more predictive and more forward-looking to hopefully stave off the bad guys. The piece that I missed in there is we take those fingerprints and we share them across our entire network. Minute by minute, we take what we caught for one customer and we aggregate that across our entire customer base, because we don't think that any security device should operate in isolation. You really need to have that network effect to be able to not reinvent the wheel every single time. There's really not a point. And the nice thing about fingerprints is they're so much more granular that you don't have to worry about the false positives. If you just took a list of bad IPs that somebody else thinks is bad and tried to apply that ACL to your site, you're going to have a lot of false positives. But with a fingerprint, it's so much more granular that it reduces that likelihood of false positives. So that's us in a nutshell, helping weed out bots and from real users. Really the core of why we built this is because people were having to spend a lot of time trying to fight this. They were using the wrong tools, web application firewalls, or developing it within their own app, and we thought we can free up that time. This makes sense as a managed service. So the nice thing about Distill is you set up the policies around what you want to catch and what you don't, and how you want us to react to that traffic, and then you don't have to think about it again. We'll continue to evolve and catch new bots. That's not your job. That's the system's. We'll just categorize them and take whatever business rule you set on that. So it reduces a lot of dev time and a lot of DevOps time. And they give a 2-month free trial for as kind of coming out to here. Just fill in Surge as in the promo code, and really the takeaway there is if you actually want to see if you have bot traffic or not, if you want to, most people actually don't know they just assume that they're fine because they haven't seen any brownouts across their infrastructure, but that's not necessarily the case. We find that most sites have more than 50% bots, 20% of them are search engines, and 30% of them are either benign or malicious. There's a lot of bad things that they could be doing. It's worth at least, turning it on and seeing what's going on across your site, where the bot's coming from, what are they doing, and then realizing if you have a problem or not. Cool, so that's me. Any questions? Awesome, well thanks for, oh yeah, go.
So I'm assuming that this tool sits as a proxy between client server model. How much overhead does that add in general?
So it's really network time that we're adding. Most of the checks that we do are asynchronous. We sometimes, depending on the browser connection coming in, we might inject a small piece of JavaScript or a small cookie or little objects that aren't going to impact the load time, and we'll append them to the end so it doesn't actually delay anything. So there's really not more than 7 to 10 milliseconds of latency introduced.
Is that for one request or 1 million requests?
So that's per request, but that's regardless of the request volume. Yeah, the appliance doesn't slow down per on volume. It actually just caps, right? So it actually stops taking connections. So when we scope out our customers' architectures, we cluster our appliances, so they can act as a hive, not. Most people can get away with just an HA pair, but if you have a really large site, for example, we power like the 13th largest site in the world, and they have a cluster of 13 appliances that all round robin through.
So are those hosted on a cloud, or you maintain your own data center?
So we offer both. We offer a cloud proxy model where we have 17 different data centers that we have our own servers in, and we can route your traffic through us and then send it back to you, scrub it before it comes back to you. Because you're introducing a network hop at that point. Now, it's not just in line behind your firewall. What we do is we cache, compress, and accelerate the content. It acts like a CDN plus bot protection. It's not as fast as, let's say, Akamai. But it's just as fast as Amazon Web Services or like a Max CDN. Depends on how much you care about every aspect of CDN speed. Now, if you already have a CDN in play, then the appliance model is the right model for you, and you can get a physical or virtual appliance. You can throw up bare metal and install our ISO on it, or you can have us ship you a box. Any other questions, guys? All right, thanks so much.